The 747's engines hummed their mechanical lullaby at 37,000 feet, somewhere over the Pacific. Most passengers dozed fitfully in their cramped seats, but Captain Vega, Whisper Castellanos, pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching clouds drift like scattered memories below. The ocean stretched endlessly, a blue-black mirror reflecting nothing but sky. She'd flown this route as a passenger only twice before, both times heading home from deployments that had carved years from her life and left scars she'd never show anyone. The commercial flight felt alien after 16 years of military cockpits. No stick between her knees, no heads-up display painting threats across her vision, no weight of a nation's expectations pressing down on her shoulders. Just recycled air and the distant crying of someone's baby. Whisper's calloused fingers traced the edge of her boarding pass, Narita to San Francisco, seat 23F, civilian clothes that still felt like a costume. She'd earned her call sign during her first combat deployment over Afghanistan. While other pilots announced their presence with thunder and flame, Whisper had perfected the art of appearing from nowhere. Her F-16 would materialize from empty sky like a ghost, enemy radar signatures vanishing before they could process the threat. Fellow pilots joked that she flew so quietly, she could sneak up on silence itself. They had no idea how right they were, or how that skill would one day save more lives than any of them could imagine. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, cutting through her reverie. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unusual radio interference. As a precaution, I'd like to ask if there are any commercial or military pilots aboard today." Whisper's hand instinctively moved toward her chest, where dog tags once hung. Old habits. Around her, passengers shifted nervously, the captain's words registering as something more serious than typical turbulence warnings. A businessman in 23E glanced at her sideways, probably wondering why a small woman in jeans and a faded Columbia University sweatshirt looked suddenly alert while everyone else appeared concerned. She knew that tone, controlled, professional, afraid. 3 rows ahead, a man in his 50s raised his hand. "Captain here, 20 years flying commercial." "Thank you, sir. Please come forward." The plane's subtle vibrations changed. Whisper felt it in her bones, the almost imperceptible shift that meant course correction. Emergency frequency changes. Something was wrong and they weren't being told what. She closed her eyes, letting muscle memory take over. Breathing slowed. Heartbeat steadied. The woman who'd once held a line against impossible odds while her wingman bled out over enemy territory was still there, just beneath the civilian surface. The businessman beside her was now staring openly. "You okay, miss?" Whisper opened her eyes and smiled. The same smile that had once convinced a Taliban commander. She was just another scared American before she'd put 2 sidewinders through his compound's main gate. "Just listening," she said quietly. Forward in the cockpit, Captain Morrison's knuckles had gone white around the yoke. 23 years of flying everything from crop dusters to transcontinental jets, and he'd never seen anything like what was painted across his radar screen. The contacts had appeared 18 minutes ago, 6 blips moving at impossible speeds, closing from the north. No transponder codes, no radio responses, just silence and geometry that defied everything he knew about aviation. Tokyo Control, United 447 Heavy. Say status of traffic bearing 040, approximately 60 miles north of our position. Morrison's voice remained steady, but his co-pilot, Janet Kim, caught the tension bleeding through his professional facade. Static, then. United 447 Tokyo Control. No traffic on scope at that bearing. Maintain heading and altitude. Kim leaned closer to the radar display. The contacts were still there, still closing. "Sir, that's impossible. I'm looking right at them." Morrison had already known what Tokyo would say. These weren't showing up on ground control because they weren't supposed to exist. The signatures were too small for bombers, too fast for anything conventional, moving in formations that suggested military training but no nation he could identify. His mind raced through possibilities: training exercise gone wrong, equipment malfunction, something worse. The passenger he'd called forward knocked on the cockpit door. Morrison buzzed him in, grateful for another set of experienced eyes. Captain David Walsh, according to his pilot's license, late 50s with the confident bearing that came from decades in left seats. "What's the situation?" Walsh asked, settling into the jump seat. Morrison pointed to the radar. 6 unknowns closing fast. No radio contact, no transponder. Air traffic control says they don't see anything. Walsh studied the display, his expression growing grim. Speed: Mach 2, maybe faster. Altitude approximately 40,000 feet, descending slowly. That's military, has to be. Walsh paused, calculating. Distance to nearest divert airport. Anchorage is 4 hours out. Tokyo's behind us, 6 hours. The radar contacts had closed to 30 miles. Morrison made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his flying career. He reached for the passenger address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. As a precaution, we're implementing enhanced safety protocols. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and remain seated until further notice." Kim shot him a look. Enhanced safety protocols wasn't standard terminology. It was the phrase airlines used when they couldn't say, "We might be in serious trouble." In seat 23F, Whisper heard the subtext clearly. She unbuckled her seatbelt. The aircraft that had been shadowing United 447 weren't showing up on civilian radar because they'd been designed not to exist. Stealth technology borrowed from programs so classified their budgets appeared as line items for office supplies and janitorial services. The lead aircraft, callsign Raven 1, maintained perfect formation 38,000 feet above the Pacific, its pilot monitoring radio frequencies with the patience of a predator. Major Alina Kozlov had been flying intercept missions for 8 years, but this assignment felt different. The orders had come down through channels so secure she'd needed 3 separate authentication codes just to read them. Target: commercial airliner United 447. Mission parameters: observe, document, do not engage unless specifically authorized. Rules of engagement: classified until further notice. Raven flight, Raven 1. Maintain current altitude and bearing. Target is descending slowly, speed constant at 540 knots. 5 aircraft confirmed in perfect unison. Kozlov's squadron was the best in the 509th Operations Group, pilots selected not just for skill, but for their ability to follow orders without question. Today, that loyalty was being tested. Through her canopy, she could see the 747's navigation lights, small and vulnerable against the vast sky. 312 souls aboard, according to the passenger manifest that had somehow appeared in her mission briefing. Men, women, children going about their civilian lives, unaware that they'd become the center of an international incident that could reshape global politics. Kozlov's radio crackled, not her squadron frequency, something else entirely. "Unknown military aircraft. This is United 447 Heavy. You are flying in proximity to civilian traffic. Please identify yourself and intentions." The voice was calm, professional. Whoever was talking knew enough about aviation to recognize military aircraft when they saw them. Kozlov checked her instruments. Impossible. The 747 was maintaining radio silence except for standard air traffic control communications. Someone else was transmitting. Raven 1 to Copper Base. Target aircraft is initiating unauthorized communication on military frequencies. Request guidance. 30 seconds of silence. Then, Raven flight maintain current position. Do not respond to civilian contact. Observe and report. But Kozlov was already studying the 747 more carefully. Something had changed about its flight pattern. subtle adjustments to heading and altitude that meant nothing to ground control, but spoke volumes to anyone who'd spent their life reading the sky. Someone aboard that civilian aircraft was thinking like a combat pilot. Her heads-up display chimed softly. New contacts, bearing southeast. The scenario was about to become far more complicated. Whisper moved through the aircraft's cabin with the casual confidence of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere. Her eyes swept across faces, worried passengers, frustrated business travelers, a young mother trying to keep her toddler calm. She noted emergency exits, counted able-bodied adults, estimated response times. Old training never died, it just waited for the right moment to resurface. The flight attendant at the galley station looked up as Whisper approached. Sarah, that was her name, according to the tag pinned to her navy blazer. 20-something, probably new to international routes, definitely unprepared for whatever was developing outside the aircraft. "Excuse me," Whisper said quietly. "I need to speak with your captain." Sarah's smile was polite but firm. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but passengers aren't allowed in the cockpit during flight. If you have a concern, I'd be happy to. Tell him there's an Air Force pilot aboard, and I need to discuss the aircraft that have been packing us for the last 15 minutes." The smile died. Sarah glanced toward the cockpit door, then back at Whisper. "Aircraft. 6 of them, military, stealth fighters, probably F-35s based on the engine signature." Whisper kept her voice conversational, matter-of-fact. "Your captain called for pilots because he's seeing something on radar that doesn't make sense. I can help." Sarah hesitated. Standard procedure was clear about cockpit access, but nothing in her training had covered this scenario. "Can you prove you're military?" Whisper reached into her wallet and produced a card that most people would mistake for expired military ID. Sarah studied it, noting the various stamps and codes that meant nothing to her but looked official enough. What she didn't know was that she was holding the flight authorization of someone who'd once been cleared to fly missions that would never appear in any history book. "Wait here," Sarah said, disappearing toward the cockpit. Through the aircraft's windows, Whisper caught the faint glint of reflected sunlight. There, 2 o'clock high, barely visible against the blue. Then 3 more contacts spread in tactical formation. Professional spacing, military precision. This wasn't a training exercise. Her phone vibrated. Text message from an unknown number. "Turn on airplane mode, now." Whisper looked around the cabin. No one else seemed to have received anything unusual. She powered down her device and slipped it back into her pocket, mind racing. Someone knew who she was. Someone knew she was aboard this flight. The cockpit door opened, and Sarah reappeared, beckoning her forward. Morrison had expected a lot of things when he'd asked for pilots. A retired airline captain, maybe some military transport experience. He hadn't expected the slight woman in civilian clothes who moved into his cockpit like she owned it. Her eyes went immediately to the radar display, then the instrument panel, reading everything with the unconscious competence of someone who'd spent years interpreting life-and-death information in milliseconds. "Vega Castellanos," she said simply. "Call sign Whisper. 16 years Air Force, recently separated." She extended her hand to Morrison, who shook it while studying her face. Something about her seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. "Captain Morrison, this is my co-pilot Janet Kim." Morrison gestured toward the radar screen. "Tell me what you think we're looking at." Whisper studied the display for 30 seconds, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd analyzed similar scenarios under considerably more dangerous circumstances. F-35 Lightning II aircraft, probably F-35 as based on the formation spacing. 6 total, flying tactical spread at approximately 40,000 feet. They're maintaining position relative to your aircraft, which means you're their primary area of interest. She paused, meeting Morrison's eyes directly. "This isn't a coincidence. They're here for something specific." Kim leaned forward. But why aren't they talking to us? Military aircraft always identify themselves to civilian traffic. Because they're not supposed to be here. Whisper's finger traced the radar contacts. Look at their positioning, classic intercept formation, but they're not moving to engage. They're escorting. The question is whether they're protecting you or containing you. Morrison felt ice forming in his stomach. Containing us from what? Before Whisper could answer, her trained ear caught something the pilots had missed. A subtle change in the engine harmonics, barely perceptible but unmistakable to someone who'd spent years listening for the whisper of incoming missiles. She looked toward the windows, then back at the radar display where new contacts were beginning to appear. "Captain," she said quietly, "I think we're about to find out." The radio erupted in a burst of static, then cleared to reveal a voice speaking heavily accented English. "United States Aircraft Designation 447. This is Colonel Chen of the People's Liberation Army Air Force. You have entered restricted airspace. Reduce altitude to flight level 280 and follow our heading immediately." The silence that followed the transmission stretched like a held breath. Morrison stared at his radio controls, as if they might spontaneously explain how a Chinese military officer had appeared on his commercial aviation frequency. Kim's hands hovered over her navigation controls, waiting for orders that would either save or doom everyone aboard. Whisper stepped closer to the radar display, her mind processing tactical information with machine-like precision. The new contacts were climbing from the southeast, 4 additional aircraft in a classic pincer formation. Chinese J-20 stealth fighters, she realized, their distinctive engine signatures barely registering on the 747's commercial radar. Someone had planned this intercept carefully. "Don't respond," she told Morrison quietly. "Not yet." "Are you insane?" Walsh, the passenger pilot, had gone pale. "They just ordered us to change course. That's a military command from a foreign power. And if we comply immediately, we confirm that we're carrying something they want." Whisper's voice remained level, but Morrison caught the edge beneath her calm exterior. "Captain, I need to know exactly what cargo this aircraft is carrying." Morrison's throat felt dry. "Standard cargo manifest. Mail, electronics, some automotive parts bound for Detroit. Nothing unusual. Nothing classified. No diplomatic pouches, no military personnel besides yourself. Just passengers and standard freight." But even as Morrison said it, doubt crept in. Airlines didn't always know what government agencies slipped onto their aircraft. Diplomatic immunity covered a lot of gray areas. The radio crackled again. "United 447, you have 30 seconds to comply with altitude change. This is not a request." Kim's voice shook slightly. "Sir, what do we do?" Whisper was already studying the tactical display, her mind running through scenarios she'd trained for but hoped never to use. 6 American F-35s maintaining overwatch. 4 Chinese J-20s closing from below. 1 civilian aircraft caught between 2 military forces, each following orders that probably made sense to someone sitting in a bunker thousands of miles away. "Morrison, does this aircraft have any emergency military frequencies?" she asked. "Yes, but..." "Tuned to guard frequency. I need to talk to those F-35s." "Ma'am, I can't authorize." Whisper turned to face him, and for the first time Morrison saw something in her eyes that made him understand why they'd called her Whisper. It wasn't about quiet flying. It was about the way she could look at you and speak so softly that you'd lean in to listen, then realize she'd just told you something that would change everything. "Captain," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "in about 90 seconds, this is going to stop being your airplane. The only question is whose airplane it becomes." Morrison's hand moved toward the radio controls. "Guard frequency. This is civilian airliner United 447 Heavy requesting immediate assistance from any U.S. military aircraft in the vicinity." Whisper's voice carried the crisp authority of someone who'd spent years making life-and-death decisions over hostile airspace. She'd taken the radio microphone from Morrison with a gesture that somehow conveyed both request and command. The response came instantly. United 447, this is Raven 1. Identify yourself and state the nature of your emergency. Raven 1, this is Major Vega Castellanos, United States Air Force, recently separated. I'm aboard a civilian aircraft currently being intercepted by foreign military assets. We have been ordered to alter course and altitude by aircraft identifying themselves as People's Liberation Army Air Force. Silence stretched across the frequency. Whisper could picture the pilot of Raven 1 checking databases, running her name through military identification systems, trying to figure out what a recently separated Air Force major was doing aboard a random commercial flight over the Pacific. Finally, Major Castellanos, confirm your service number and last duty assignment. Whisper rattled off the numbers burned into her memory, then added quietly, last assignment was 480th Fighter Squadron, Spangdahlem Air Base, specialized in close air support and deep penetration missions. Another pause, then a different voice, older and carrying the weight of command authority. Major Castellanos, this is Colonel Hayes commanding Raven Flight. We're aware of your service record. Please stand by. Kim looked confused. Service record, how would they? Because she's not just any pilot, Morrison interrupted, pieces clicking together. He'd heard that call sign before, in conversations between military controllers during his National Guard days. Stories passed in whispers about a pilot who'd turned the tide during the Battle of Kandahar Province, who'd held off an entire Taliban offensive with nothing but an F-16 and nerves of steel. The Chinese voice returned, sharper now. United States aircraft, you have failed to comply. Reduce altitude immediately or we will be forced to take protective action. Whisper keyed the microphone again. Raven 1, advise your current rules of engagement regarding civilian aircraft under foreign intercept. Whisper, rules of engagement are classified. We are authorized to observe and protect civilian aircraft from hostile action. Cannot engage foreign military unless fired upon. Copy that, Raven 1. She turned to Morrison. Captain, they can't start a war over one airplane, but they can finish one if someone makes the wrong choice. I need you to maintain current heading and altitude. The Chinese pilot said. The Chinese pilot is bluffing. If they intended to shoot us down, they would have done it already. This is a test of resolve, not a prelude to combat. Morrison's hands trembled slightly on the controls. How can you be sure? Whisper's smile was grim, because I've been on the other side of this conversation. 8 years earlier, Whisper had been the one giving orders to civilian aircraft caught in military airspace. The memory surfaced unbidden. A Pakistani transport plane that had strayed into Afghan airspace during a particularly tense period of border negotiations. She'd been flying patrol in her F-16, watching the lumbering cargo aircraft through her heads-up display, while diplomatic channels burned with angry voices. The parallels were unsettling. Different sky, different stakes, but the same fundamental question. How far was someone willing to escalate before backing down? Raven 1, this is Whisper. Request permission to communicate directly with intercepting aircraft. Negative, Whisper. Maintain radio discipline. We have assets en route to provide additional support. Additional support meant more American fighters were coming. Whisper felt the familiar weight of tactical responsibility settling across her shoulders. Every decision made in the next few minutes would ripple outward, potentially affecting millions of lives. The Chinese formation had closed to within 10 miles, close enough that Morrison could see their navigation lights with the naked eye. 4 sleek shapes maintaining perfect spacing, their angular stealth design making them look like geometric nightmares against the afternoon sky. United 447, This is your final warning. Reduce altitude to flight level 280 or face the consequences. Morrison's finger hovered over the altitude selector. Standard procedure said comply with military commands to preserve civilian life, but Whisper's hand covered his before he could make the adjustment. Not yet, she said. Give me 60 more seconds. For what? To remember how to be the scariest pilot in the sky. She took the microphone and switched to the international emergency frequency, a channel monitored by every military and civilian aircraft within 300 miles. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the courtesy expected between opposing forces. This was the tone she'd used during her final mission, the one that had earned her a classified commendation and early retirement. Attention all aircraft in vicinity of position 36 north, 160 west. This is Major Vega Castellanos, United States Air Force. Be advised that civilian airliner United 447 is currently under unlawful intercept by foreign military aircraft. Any aggressive action against this civilian aircraft will be considered an act of war. Kim stared at her. You can't just declare. I didn't declare anything. I stated a fact. Whisper's eyes never left the radar display. And I just told every intelligence agency monitoring this frequency exactly who they're dealing with. The effect was immediate. The Chinese formation's aggressive approach vectors began to shallow out. Someone in Beijing was running her name through databases, discovering why a recently separated Air Force major might be worth avoiding. Clever, Morrison admitted, but what happens when they figure out you're bluffing? Whisper's smile was razor-thin. Who says I'm bluffing? In the command center, buried 300 feet beneath the Pentagon, General Patricia Hawthorne was having the worst day of her 30-year military career. The wall-mounted displays showed a situation that existed in the gray area between international incident and act of war. American and Chinese military aircraft facing off over international waters, while a civilian airliner hung in the balance. Sir, we have confirmation that Major Castellanos is aboard the intercepted aircraft, reported Colonel Martinez, his voice tight with stress. She's initiated contact with both our fighters and the Chinese formation. Hawthorne studied the tactical display. Red icons for Chinese aircraft, blue for American, white for the civilian 747 caught between them. Simple symbols representing a complexity that could spiral into global conflict within minutes. What's the status of the Castellanos file? Still classified under Special Access Program protocols. The Chinese don't have access to her complete service record, but they know enough to be cautious. That was something, at least. Whisper's final mission, the one that had saved a forward operating base and earned her early retirement with full honors, remained buried under classification levels that would keep it secret for another 20 years. But intelligence services worldwide knew the call sign, knew enough to recognize when they were dealing with someone who could turn a routine intercept into an international crisis. Sir, Martinez continued, we have conflicting directives. State Department wants the civilian aircraft to comply with Chinese demands to de-escalate. Joint Chiefs want our fighters to maintain protective posture. And Pacific Fleet Command is requesting permission to scramble additional assets from Kadena. Hawthorne closed her eyes. Every option led to escalation. Comply with Chinese demands, and America appeared weak in front of every hostile power watching. Refuse to comply and risk starting a shooting war over a single airplane. Send more fighters and guarantee that this incident would dominate international headlines for months. What does Castellanos want? She asked finally. Martinez checked his communications log. Unknown. She's maintained radio silence on military channels for the last 3 minutes, but civilian aircraft reports she's requested access to their backup radio systems. Backup radio systems. Emergency military transponder. If activated, It would identify the aircraft as carrying U.S. military personnel, subject to protection under international law. Hawthorne understood immediately. Whisper was giving everyone a way out. Classify the aircraft as military transport, and the Chinese could withdraw without losing face. But it would also mean admitting that they'd intercepted a U.S. military asset in international airspace. "General," Martinez said quietly, "decision point in 30 seconds. The Chinese have requested final confirmation of our intentions." Hawthorne looked at the display one more time, then made the choice that would define her legacy. Activate the emergency transponder. The moment the transponder activated, Whisper felt the shift in the aircraft's identity like a physical weight settling over her shoulders. United 447 Heavy was no longer a civilian airliner. It had become, in the eyes of international law, a United States military aircraft under her command. Morrison stared at the instrument panel where new indicators had illuminated. "How did you?" "Emergency provisions," Whisper explained, though the full truth was more complicated. Any military officer aboard a civilian aircraft can claim command authority during international incidents. It's an old regulation, rarely used. What she didn't mention was that the regulation required specific authorization codes that theoretically should have been revoked when she separated from active duty. The fact that they still worked meant someone very highly placed wanted her to have this authority. The Chinese formation's radio chatter had increased dramatically. Whisper could hear the tension in their voices as they requested new instructions from their command authority. Intercepting a civilian airliner was one thing. Engaging a U.S. military aircraft was an entirely different level of international crisis. Colonel Chen to Chinese ground control. Target aircraft has been reclassified as United States military asset. Request updated engagement parameters. Whisper keyed her microphone. "Colonel Chen, this is Major Castellanos. I'm assuming command of this aircraft under United States Code Title 10. Your intercept is no longer lawful under international aviation law." A long pause. Then, "Major Castellanos, we have reports that you are no longer active duty United States Air Force." "Correct, Colonel. But I'm still a United States citizen aboard a United States aircraft, and you're still in international airspace making threats against civilians." Through the cockpit windows, the Chinese formation was visible now, 4 angular shapes that seemed to bend light around their edges. Beautiful aircraft, Whisper had to admit. The J-20 represented a generation of Chinese military technology that had closed the gap with American capabilities faster than most Pentagon analysts had predicted. Morrison's voice was barely audible. "What happens now?" "Now we find out whether anyone wants to start World War III over airplane tickets." The radio crackled with a new voice, speaking in rapid Chinese. Whisper caught enough words to understand that Colonel Chen was receiving direct orders from Beijing. Her Mandarin was functional, 6 months of language training before a classified deployment, but she could read the tone clearly enough. They were being told to disengage. "Major Castellanos," Chen's voice returned, more formal now, "by order of Central Military Commission, we are terminating this intercept. Maintain current heading. You are cleared to continue to your destination." The 4 J-20s peeled away with fluid grace, their forms disappearing into the haze like mirages dissolving. On radar, they remained visible for another few minutes before vanishing entirely, stealth systems activated. Morrison exhaled slowly. "Is it over?" Whisper watched the American F-35s maintaining their escort positions. "Not yet." The American fighters maintained their protective formation for another hour, invisible guardians ensuring that United 447 reached international waters safely. Whisper remained in the cockpit, monitoring radio traffic and watching the tactical display, until the last F-35 disappeared from their scope with a final radio call. "Whisper, this is Raven 1. Safe flight home, Semper Fi." Raven 1 whisper, "Until Valhalla." The military phraseology felt natural, comfortable in a way that civilian conversation never quite managed. Morrison noticed how Whisper's entire bearing had changed during the crisis. Shoulders straighter, voice carrying authority that seemed to expand beyond her physical presence. This was how she'd been in the Air Force, he realized. This was who she'd been before whatever had brought her back to civilian life. "So," Kim said as normal flight operations resumed, "want to tell us what really happened back there?" Whisper settled into the jump seat, suddenly looking tired. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. Someone wanted to intercept this aircraft, someone else wanted to prevent it, and we got caught in between. The question is why." Morrison had been thinking the same thing. Any theories? "Could be anything. Wrong place, wrong time, or," she hesitated, "could be someone knew I was aboard." "You think this was about you specifically?" "I think there are people in several governments who prefer that certain former Air Force pilots stay retired and quiet." Whisper rubbed her temples, where a headache was building. "The problem with having a classified service record is that you never know who's still keeping track." Walsh leaned forward. "What kind of missions did you fly that would make foreign governments nervous?" The question hung in the air unanswered. Whisper stared out the cockpit windows at empty sky, remembering missions that officially never happened, targets that were never struck, lives that were never saved. The kind of operations that won wars from the shadows and left no trace beyond the nightmares of the people who flew them. "The kind that don't appear in any history books," she said finally. Morrison made a decision that would change the trajectory of all their lives. "Major, would you be willing to stay in the cockpit until we land? As a precaution?" Whisper nodded. She'd been planning to return to her seat, to blend back into civilian anonymity and pretend the last 2 hours hadn't happened. But something told her this wasn't over. International incidents didn't resolve themselves so cleanly, and the fact that someone had been tracking her movements suggested larger forces at work. "I'll stay," she agreed. "But Captain, when we land, I think you should request a priority inspection of this aircraft's cargo." The remainder of the flight to San Francisco passed in relative quiet, but Whisper couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. Her eyes moved constantly between the radar display and the windows, scanning for threats that might not show up on civilian sensors. Years of combat flying had taught her to trust instincts that operated faster than conscious thought. Morrison had reported the incident to both Air Traffic Control and United Airlines Operations, but the official response had been strangely muted. "Continue to destination, maintain normal procedures, file complete report upon landing." Nothing about military escort, nothing about international incidents, nothing that acknowledged what had actually happened. Kim was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "This feels wrong. We should have fighter escorts, priority landing clearance, federal agents waiting at the gate. Instead, they're treating this like a minor navigation issue." "Because someone wants it treated that way," Whisper replied. "The question is whether it's our side trying to avoid publicity or someone else trying to avoid scrutiny." Through the cockpit windows, the California coastline began to resolve from haze into recognizable geography. San Francisco Bay spread beneath them, the Golden Gate Bridge spanning blue water like a thread connecting two worlds. Under different circumstances, Whisper would have found the view beautiful. Today, she was calculating approach vectors and emergency landing sites. United 447 Heavy, San Francisco approach control. Turn left heading 270, descend, and maintain 16,000 feet. Contact tower on 120.5 approaching the marker. Standard approach procedures. No emergency protocols, no expedited handling, as if nothing unusual had happened. Morrison began the routine of preparing for landing, but Whisper noticed his eyes kept returning to the radar display. "Anything?" she asked. Clean scope, no military aircraft showing, but his voice carried uncertainty. "Major, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "When you were active duty, how often did situations like this happen?" Whisper considered her answer carefully. "More often than civilians knew about. Less often than military planners prepared for. The world's full of places where opposing forces watch each other across invisible lines, waiting to see who blinks first." "And who blinks?" "Usually whoever has the most to lose." She gestured toward the passenger cabin. "Today, that was us. 300 civilians tend to outweigh political posturing." But even as she said it, Whisper knew the truth was more complex. The Chinese had withdrawn not because of civilian lives, but because someone in Beijing had recognized her name and decided the risk wasn't worth the potential consequences. Her reputation had become a weapon she carried everywhere, even in retirement. The landing gear extended with mechanical precision, and United 447 began its final approach to San Francisco International Airport. The 747 touched down on runway 28L with barely a bump, Morrison's years of experience showing in the smooth transition from flight to ground roll. But as they taxied toward the gate, Whisper noticed irregularities that would have been invisible to civilian passengers. Ground crews waiting in positions that suggested security rather than standard operations. Vehicles with government plates parked near the jet bridge. Men in dark suits who moved with the purposeful efficiency of federal agents. "Looks like we have a welcoming committee," Morrison observed dryly. Whisper unbuckled her harness and stood, preparing to return to her passenger seat. "Captain, it's been an honor. Thank you for trusting a stranger with your aircraft." "Major," Morrison called as she reached the cockpit door. "Whatever you did during your service, thank you. I don't think we'd have made it home without you." She paused, looking back at the 3 commercial pilots who just lived through something that would probably be classified before their incident reports reached the right desks. "You would have been fine. Good pilots always find a way." But as Whisper made her way back through the cabin, she caught fragments of conversation that told her the situation was far from over. Passengers were discussing the unusual approach procedures, the emergency vehicles visible through the windows, the way flight attendants kept checking their watches with nervous precision. At seat 23F, her traveling companion, the businessman who'd been watching her since the incident began, stood as she approached. "Ms. Castellanos," he said quietly, "my name is Agent David Park, FBI. I need you to remain aboard after the other passengers deplane." Whisper settled into her seat without surprise. She'd been expecting this conversation since the moment she'd identified herself over military radio. "Let me guess, someone wants to discuss my travel plans." Among other things. Park's ID was real, his manner professional but not hostile. "There are questions about how you came to be aboard this particular flight, on this particular route, at this particular time." "Coincidence," Whisper replied simply. "Ma'am, in my experience, there's no such thing as coincidence when former special operations pilots end up in the middle of international incidents." Through the window, Whisper could see passengers beginning to gather there.